Let's get back to the animals. The animals. The animals. So, one thing that's fairly easy to measure, depending on the setup, is what has happened to a creature. Another thing that's easy to measure is how they respond. What's hard to measure is what's going on in between, right? And we call that cognition. So those are internal states that are going to produce some behavior. But that's not directly measurable. And so if we could figure out what was going on around it, maybe we could start trying to isolate variables. But it requires us to be very clever about how we are going to interpret a creature's response. Um, Even humans who can tell us how they behave or why they acted are sometimes wrong, as we've seen from the uh, split brain studies and other confabulation examples. So we've talked about cognition. We spent an entire section on it. We talked about perception and reasoning. This video, this lecture is all about theory of mind. We haven't spent a lot of time on memory or language, but those are other aspects of cognition, right? You know, those aren't going to be fancy. And so we can study a creature and see how they respond to it, situations that we present them. But again, how we interpret what's going on in them is going to require a fairly robust theory, whether it's Morgan's canon and we just interpret them as like behaviorist black boxes, or it's something else, in which case we might think that they have internal states and desires. It's something that we need to spend some time thinking about. And the fear here is that we are fooling ourselves. And to illustrate this, I thought I would tell you the story of Clever Hans. Clever Hans was a horse who could do math. He could do addition, division, multiplication, um, some exponents, some other kinds of problems. He had a rudimentary understanding of German, rudimentary understanding of English, really lots of things. He was super duper clever, super clever. The person who started working on Clever Hans was this German scientist who started training a cat, a bear, and a horse to try to figure out whether they could be taught lots of things that humans could. The cat ignored him. The bear was scary and dangerous. But the horse, this Hans, actually developed quite a few capabilities. And it was one of those, it's one of these examples in the history of animal research that people will point to when I show examples of other seemingly complex behavior. Because Clever Hans was taken on tour, and lots of scientists were able to test him one-on-one and see if he actually could add, subtract, multiply, and so on. And he could. Every scientist, until one, found that Clever Hans actually had all of the capabilities that were alleged. But there was one particular scientist who didn't quite buy the story. And he started isolating variables. He started having different people ask questions. He started having people ask questions to which they didn't know the answers. He started asking questions in different languages, in made-up languages. And what he found out was that Clever Hans was really, really good at giving you the answer. Oh, I should probably say how he gave the answer. Otherwise, you think he's like a Mr. Ed. Clever Hans would stomp his foot. And if you asked, for example, what's 2 + 2, he would stomp his foot 4 times. and then he would stop. And then this researcher found that actually a lot of the people that were asking the questions were asking them in weirdly predictable ways. They would lean forward and have their shoulders tense when they asked questions. And then as soon as Hans got to the correct answer, they would relax and Hans would stop. And so he managed to set up scenarios where the question askers did not know the answer, or where they would pretend to be satisfied with a different answer, and Hans would no longer give the correct answers. And every time I bring this up in class, people are like, well, doesn't that mean that he was actually super smart? He could like read what people wanted as the answer? Yeah, sure it does. But the abilities that he was alleged to have were different than the ones he actually had, which is the reason that a lot of people that work in animal cognition are very scared of clever Hans cases, because it might be that they are fooling themselves. They think that the creatures are exhibiting one kind of intelligence, but they're actually exhibiting a different kind of intelligence. So there's a bunch of videos linked here, and I'll include them in the description, of crows learning using tools, of Alex, this parrot, learning how to use concepts and describing items in a variety of ways, of cows tricking the devices that feed them so they can get extra food, of the killer whales being diabolical. So just watch those videos and then we'll talk about them in class. The fear is, and this is another video, the fear is that these creatures that are exhibiting seemingly complex behavior, like learning how to use tools on first observation, or figuring out how to trick automatic devices, or killing creatures, might actually be an illusion. This here is a slime mold. A slime mold is it's single cell, but it's a conglomerate of many single-celled creatures that it turns out if you put it in a maze, it can figure out how to get from one end to the other. And the way it does it is by trying all of the paths, really, and then eventually going down one. So you might say, could a single-celled creature run a maze? And you would say no, but in fact, this is evidence that it is possible, which suggests that maybe we are being uncreative in how we think about animal cognition. Or maybe we're exporting too much of our own wishes and our own thoughts about how cognition works. Another thing, this is going to be the last thing, well, second to last thing before I end this lecture. And then the next lecture, we're going to spend the entire time talking about animals and not doing any of the backup. There's something called the mirror test, which is roughly a test to see if animals can recognize themselves. So you put a dot on a creature's forehead and you show it a mirror, and you see if the creature reaches for the mirror or for their own forehead. If they reach for their own forehead, it suggests that they know that the mirror is themselves. They can identify themselves elsewhere. Great apes will do this, dolphins will do this, magpies, but not other kinds of birds. Perhaps elephants pass it, it's unclear. Some cool videos of them reaching around a mirror. Other creatures fail it. Lots of non-great apes, monkeys, other birds, dogs fail the mirror test. But the weird thing about the mirror test is that it is a visual test. And a lot of animals are not visual animals. So being able to recognize oneself in a mirror which we take to be important for being able to recognize oneself as an agent, for being able to understand the difference between yourself and the rest of nature. It might not be that impressive if dogs fail, because they are smell creatures rather than visual creatures. If we could design a smell version of the mirror test, maybe that would turn out to be more fair to the dogs. As Frans de Waal says, are we smart enough to know how smart animals are? Okay. So, it turns out that animals that operate in large groups tend to have large bodies, large brains. So it might be helpful for us to look at for intelligence in other creatures that are similar to us in terms of having complex societies, like elephants and great apes and dolphins. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about some creatures that don't have these phenomena, that behave in ways that seem to be intelligent, but that aren't correlated with being highly social. But that's later. The point of this lecture is just the question about how unique humans are, how do we assess the intelligence of creatures, and how cautious do we have to be before we're being too cautious.